I'm Ben Smith,
I'm Nayeema.
and this is Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media.
Today, we're going to talk about a big split that's been in the news. And no, it's not Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck, RIP, but it's the breakup between powerful people and the traditional media.
Yeah, I'm not a J-Lo expert, but I believe this has actually been even a longer time in coming.
It's true. I thought you're not a JLo expert at all, Ben.
I have big blind spots. We can talk about that later.
But the conversation has really been about who gets the access to hold powerful people to account. And this is a big story, particularly in this political cycle where we've seen President Biden give interviews to, say, Howard Stern over the New York Times. And Vice President Kamala Harris, now the Democratic presidential nominee, has just given her second major national interview since being anointed in July. So this is a big conversation. And one area where we've seen it play out is actually in the tech world.
Yeah. I mean, no one has had a bigger arc from a sort of love affair with the media and being lionized to being demonized and hating the media. And I think that their experience with this and their ability to fight back is pretty unique.
But I think the question here is this new kind of media safe space for CEOs and politicians just smart PR strategy on their part and the natural end state of a fragmented media? Is it the slow death of accountability for people in power? Or is it some right sizing of journalism's relevance and power?
I think yes is the answer to all those questions.
Yes to all of those.
I mean, certainly a sort of a shift in who has power.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest part of it.
Well, to dive into this, we'll bring in one of the people who's been really at the forefront of this shift, Jason Calacanis. He's an entrepreneur, investor, and a podcaster you may know as one of the besties from All In and one of the beneficiaries of the recent turn to, say, tech podcasts over traditional media. Both President Trump and vice presidential nominee JD Vance have shown up recently for the All In bros, as have Elon Musk and others.
Yeah, Jason's been around doing versions of this forever, but never this successfully.
All right, we'll be right back after this break. So let's dive in. So this topic, which could be called, is it the death of journalistic access? Is it the Times et al. Versus the tech bros? There's a lot of ways to kind of glibly describe what feels like the latest stage in a splintering between media and power, and particularly media and tech. And we should probably explain why it's in the news cycle right now.
Yeah, I think it's on our minds this week in part because Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta, one of the real newsmakers in the world, who used to give a fair number of open combative interviews, still occasionally will, but gave a really big interview this week, not to the Wall Street Journal, but to a couple of VCs for a podcast called Acquired, hosted by two investors turned podcasters, Ben Gilbert and David Rosenthal. It was an interview before 6,000 adoring fans at the Chase Center. And was I think did not purport to be something that was pressing him for accountability. Sort of was intended to be something that was giving him, kind of an open platform to explore his ideas and to talk to his fans.
I think that the truth is it's not either or. Mark Zuckerberg gave an interview this summer to Bloomberg, particularly when they're publicly traded companies. They kind of have to, come talk to someone like Andrew Ross Sorkin on Squawk Box or DealBook, right? These are outlets that they're turning to, but they no longer want to show up for, the accountability interview with my former colleague, Kara Swisher, for example.
Right, and there's by the way, like the mainstream media also has its share of access journalists and softball interviews, but there's been a real shift. There's basically a new set of platforms that CEOs in particular like to turn to when they have something to say because fundamentally because they know they're not going to get jammed up.
And when you read, for example, Mike Isaac's reporting in the New York Times, it sounded like a little bit like, oh, this is this adoring crowd that includes the VIP status of it all, the fact that it was backed by JP Morgan Chase, the NVIDIA CEO shows up, it was a kind of who's who in the tech world at this event. And the conversation really did start off with a softball about what Mark was wearing.
We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
I think this is actually very appropriate. First, we have to ask you about your shirt and what you're wearing.
Which is honestly kind of an important question because his glow up has been a topic of social conversation and we haven't really known the answer. And here's some of it.
So I've kind of started working on this series of shirts with some of my favorite classical sayings on them. So this one is pathe mathos, learning through suffering. It's a little family saying, and also Aeschylus.
Aeschylus up there
Honestly,
with Prada
sometimes
and
you learn a
Gucci.
lot from softball interviews. What a great question. What?
Yes, but then it does get to this critical moment where Mark is asked, hey, your company's done a lot of amazing things, but it's also had a lot of criticism. And of all those criticisms, which do you believe is the most legitimate and why? And then Mark starts off by acknowledging that, yes, Facebook, now Meta, has made many mistakes. Many of the criticisms are legitimate. And he gets to this core part of the answer.
But I think one of the things that I look back on and regret is I think we accepted other people's view of some of the things that they were asserting that we were doing wrong or were responsible for that I don't actually think we were. And now there were a lot of things we did mess up and we needed to fix. But I think that there's this view where when you're a company and someone says that there's an issue, I think the right instinct is to take ownership for it, right? Say okay, maybe it's not maybe it's not all our thing, but we're going to fully own this problem. We're going to take responsibility for it. We're going to fix it. But when it's a political problem, I actually think a lot of the time, sometimes there are people who are operating in good faith who are identifying a problem that wants something to be fixed, and there are people who are just looking for someone to blame. People are basically blaming social media and the tech industry for all these different things in society. And if we're saying, okay, we're gonna really do our part to go fix this stuff, I think that there were a bunch of people who just took that and were like, oh, you're taking responsibility for that? Let me kick you for more stuff.
So you've produced a lot of tough interviews in your life. What did you hear going on there?
Well, I think what you heard there was a lot of and ah at the top of that answer is Mark really reflecting. It felt like a lot of space. He wasn't being pressed. And I think you heard him kind of really reflecting on his own role. There's a lot of media criticism without naming the media in there, right? He's effectively saying, look, I took more blame than I needed to. I did it because it was expedient in some way, and yet it was not accurate.
Yeah, the courage to say I was right all along.
Well, do you think that is inaccurate?
I think it's partly accurate and partly inaccurate. I think what's so interesting, though, right, is that the question is handing to him the judgment of what's a fair question, what's a fair challenge. And that's a difference from the kind of interview I think you and I like to do, where we at least try to figure out what we think and push someone and challenge the interviewer, not say to them, "What do you think is legitimate criticism?" I mean, it abdicates the role of the journalist, but although that said, takes all sorts and got a really, really interesting answer. And so I don't. I mean, I actually think a lot of these shows are great and are interesting, but they are doing something different, and you can see why a CEO would rather be asked, "What criticism do you think is legitimate?" than
Then
pressed on
be asked
criticism
15, a lightning round of 15 criticisms, which is
or
probably
one.
what, yeah, or one really deep one. Now, but I do think you get something uh, which is something revelatory about how someone in power thinks, and and what you get in lieu of that, right? What you're getting in these traditional press interviews is one, either you're not getting them at all, right? Mark Zuckerberg is not coming and sitting down with,
With
this
us,
for this.
call us, Mark.
When's the last time you talked to Mark?
Not recently, but I'm hopeful. I think we just have to make him feel like it's a challenge. Like he's doing these easy things, but he's got to do. We do this not because it is easy, but because it is hard, as Kennedy said.
Yes. It's like he was doing that, what is it called? The Murphy with a workout where you do the 100 squats,
Right? He
100
does all this
push-ups,
hard
the
stuff.
things,
He should come
this
on the
hard
show and do a
stuff.
hard interview.
But hearing how these people in power think is important. And when the alternative is not hearing it at all, or hearing them kind of be cornered and not getting a lot out of them, or hearing them shut down, I don't know. I think there's a value in this.
Yeah, for sure, I agree with you on that.
And I also think there's a spectrum between the kind of hardball interview and the Joe Rogan MMA interview. This interview with the Acquired guys and the podcast I quite like is something in between. And Acquired isn't really competing with us. I think Acquired is more competing with Harvard Business Review.
I wish we were competing with Acquired. Right, one way of viewing this is that there's room for everybody. The other way of
Mhm.
viewing it, which I think some in the tech world view it, is this is an alternative to ever having to deal with journalists.
Do you think that's fair? Or do you think that's us painting a picture that makes it feel existential to journalism?
I think it depends who in the tech world you're talking to. There's certainly people in the tech world who are very radicalized against independent journalism and think
Yeah.
it's fundamentally destructive and out to get them.
Well, they wouldn't even call it independent journalism. They would call it mainstream journalism or corporate journalism, as opposed to the kind of independent citizen journalism that they're fans of, right?
Yeah, right. And they believe it's
Right.
manipulated by their enemies to destroy them.
So people like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen are in this camp,
Yeah, I
right?
think Mark is kind of patient zero for this. The thing about this story is it goes way back. It's a love hate relationship in which the two sides have been intertwined since the 90s. I mean, these folks in Silicon Valley built these platforms that we work on and fell in that I certainly fell in love with in the aughts. And initially, were covered as these fascinating, disruptive entrepreneurs who weren't really wielding much power, but who were doing cool stuff. And they were covered that way. People like Steve Jobs were great at manipulating the media and presenting their own story and using it to market themselves. And then I think if I had to date the real poisoning of the relationship, it's when Nick Denton, the founder of Gawker, brings Valleywag to Silicon Valley in the,
Mhm,
in the mid aughts, and in 2007 outs Peter Thiel as gay in a way that was
mhm,
that felt not wrongly mean spirited and a little pointless. But the folks in Silicon Valley who had considered themselves private citizens when they weren't being
mhm.
gods really hated it.
The other thing that probably is worth noting there is, like, just to update that history a bit, is it leads to this landmark kind of legal battle between, unexpectedly, Hulk Hogan and Gawker by
Right.
the mid 2010s, right?
Yeah, Thiel responded by financing a big, real conspiracy to destroy Gawker and succeeded.
That is one of the key points. Tell us about some of the others that you think really, like, eroded the relationship between tech and media.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, as tech became more powerful and as tech media became higher stakes, more confrontational business journalism, more like political journalism, the relationship got worse and worse. I would say John Carreyrou's investigative reporting of Theranos was a real signal moment where particularly journalists thought, "Wow, some of these companies are total frauds." And then the real moment in this, I just think so obviously, is the election of Donald Trump. The East Coast media, in some ways, thinking this can't just be because of the voters. There's got to be some conspiracy. There's a huge amount of coverage of the notion that Russia, which helped, was central to this, and a huge amount of coverage of the idea that Facebook, maybe through a firm called Cambridge Analytica, somehow created this anomalous situation in which Trump was elected. And a lot of it was nonsense in retrospect.
Well, what was not nonsense is that Cambridge Analytica had taken the data of, I think, tens of millions, I think 80 something millions of Facebook users without their permission. And Cambridge Analytica was, of course, a firm advising Donald Trump. But the idea that, yeah, Facebook rigged the election, if that was your Cliff's notes from it, is absolutely inaccurate. But between 2012 and 2016, 2017, there's this huge shift from, like, the kind of fawning journalism that you'd see at TechCrunch and other places. It started to shift, and it was very quick at some point, because you remember in 2016 there's conversation about, will Mark Zuckerberg run for president? And
Yeah.
to some people it seems like a really good idea, and by 2018 it's like Mark Zuckerberg hates democracy is kind of the headline. And so what a rapid shift that occurred. And I think the stakes here, like, what are the stakes of this? Well, I think there's an expectation of, like, as you amass power, as people on one side of that seesaw amass power, then the other side of that seesaw, which is like journalism, the fourth estate, whatever, has to up its ante, has to kind of continually hold power to account in different ways.
It also happened with such, as you talk about it, like, just think about the disorienting speed of going from being a random startup guy to being one of the most powerful people in the world. And for journalists who'd been covering these kind of quirky, interesting projects to suddenly being told their job was to hold power to account. I think it was a really dizzying, disorienting experience,
Yeah.
particularly for the subjects of coverage. You see why they lost their minds over it.
Totally. I think the contempt can be best summarized as this, which is tech founders held journalists a bit in contempt for their lack of technical acumen, their lack of, um, you know, uh, what they see as balance, and even their lack of achievement.
When you say their lack of achievement, you mean that they're poorer,
That they're
right?
poor, exactly.
Thanks.
Well,
Yeah, for clearing
yes,
that up.
poor, and that was best kind of summarized by Balaji, VC, who's very active on Twitter, often embroiled in, takedowns of people like Taylor Lorenz or other journalists, who subtweeted, quote, "Guy who has built nothing thinks he can critique guy who has built web browser," referring respectively to our former colleague, New York Times tech reporter Kevin Roos, and your former investor, Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz, venture capital fame. And so both sides think the other is below them. Yes, tech people think that, but journalists also think that founders are devoid of ethics, are devoid of any sensibility about their own power, and influence and impact, right? So there's contempt in both worlds. There's also this sense of, hey, we can actually own you. Jeff Bezos literally owns the Washington Post. Lauren Powell Jobs owns majority of The Atlantic. Marc Benioff of Salesforce fame owns Time magazine, and Elon Musk owning Twitter, right? There's a sense of like, we will literally own you.
There's a funny A, we don't care. B, we're so obsessed with you that we talk about nothing else. And C, we're powerless victims of a powerful media. And D, like I am the richest man in the world. And I'm just going to buy the platform, own it, and drive it in the direction I feel like. It's a very complicated, important story.
And the truth is, like, you probably, in covering something, you don't want to drink the Kool-Aid. Like, you don't want to be a Kool-Aid addict when you're covering the thing, but you also don't want to be, I think, allergic to the Kool-Aid, predisposed to hate the Kool-Aid.
So that's a great way to put it. You want to sample the Kool Aid. Like, is this like a wine taster? You spit it out.
You're a Kool-Aid sommelier, I think. And the question is, though, when you're drinking the Kool-Aid, when you're pumping out the Kool-Aid yourself, as the all-in guys are, being venture capitalists, can you be the people that are covering not just tech, but also politics, also everything? So let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with Jason Calacanis.
This week on our Think with Google segment, I'm talking to Josh Spanier about how AI is bringing more joy and less stress to shopping. It's only fall, but the coming holidays are a huge deal in marketing every year. How are you preparing for them, and what role do you think AI plays this holiday season?
Well, Ben, I'm about to blow your mind, or at least I blew my mind when I was
Hmm.
reading on Think with Google, an Ipsos study which showed that last July, so a couple of months ago now, about a third of American consumers had already started their Christmas shopping. I'm not that organized. I'm pretty sure you're not that organized as well, but it speaks to the importance of starting early. One of the things we're seeing is there are all sorts of smart retailers are taking advantage of AI to enhance the shopping experience. So using Gemini, if you actually get richer product descriptions written, which Gemini can do at scale for every product and every sort of use case, and put it on your website, customers are actually more confident in buying because they know better about the product. And we're seeing higher sell rates from people who are actually doing that sort of work. I've seen some really interesting work. Booking.com is an interesting company. They sell hotel rooms and experiences. They built a chatbot experience really enhanced by AI to actually navigate the millions of possibilities of rooms, events, and experiences they sell to create a truly interactive shopping experience. Again, AI making shopping for travel, which is not always the easiest thing, a much more enjoyable experience.
Where do we find out more about this, Josh?
Head over to thinkwithgoogle.com. There's loads of content about retailing, shopping, and the use of AI for the Christmas and holiday season. And Ben, if it's not too soon, happy holidays.
Happy Hanukkah, Josh.
So, Ben, in a moment, we're going to play this interview that we taped earlier today with Jason Calacanis, a media entrepreneur. Explain maybe a little bit who Jason is, because I've met him at some code conferences, some poker parties, known him a little bit over the course of media, but you have a longer history with him and you wanted to book him. Why?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the sort of rivalry and dance between tech and media, Jason is someone who has been, for better and for worse, in the middle of that since the early 1990s, when he was, I think, really initially seen as a journalist in New York who became a founder, investor,
Made an early bet on Uber that has really paid off, as well as other companies.
is now basically someone who tech guys who hate journalists go to explain to them what's wrong with journalists and how maybe journalists aren't that bad, and who journalists love to hate. All of this helped by the fact that he's a co-host of All In, one of the truly successful business podcasts that has actually displaced a bunch of business media. He's interviewed JD Vance, Donald Trump, has a huge platform, not universally, I would say, beloved outside his bubble.
And maybe what the All In boys would mock for calling a quote trigger warning, and it is not that. But Jason seemed to think that we were very tweaked by his presence, and so I just want to caution listeners as you're listening to this, you're going to hear it was a much more of a adversarial conversation than I expected it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're both a little like sick of the stereotype, like media's out to get tech, vice versa conversation, which has kind of run its course. But like, man, was Jason here for it?
He was, and also I think we got to some insight and some kind of conversation, which we really wanted to have about what is going on here. When did the rift start? Can it be solved? And is there a cost to this?
I mean, it's one of the highest stakes media stories in the world and has been for the last decade.
All right. Hope you guys enjoy the conversation.
I'm here to deliver the ratings.
Oh, it's just honestly, Jason, it's so brave of you to subject yourself to this kind of hostile environment, East Coast environment.
What will I do with all your media elite, New York Times and Elite college. What will this poor kid from Brooklyn do?
But Jason, do you really think you're not elite?
Well, I mean, I'm not elite in the way you guys are because you would never let me into your institutions, but I have more money than all of you. But I probably don't have more money than your parents. So
That's not true at all,
Mm.
Jason.
I'm
That's
joking with you. Have a sense of humor. My God, you
Jason.
barbecue me on your
The,
podcast all the time. Have a sense of humor.
Don't worry, it'll be a very fun barbecue, Jason.
I do think I would let you into our. I think we would let you into our institutions, Jason. But seriously, thank you. I really appreciate you doing this. This story of kind of the tech media boundary, how porous it is, how um, contested it is. You've just been walking it the whole time.
Yeah. I love the media. Yeah.
You love the media?
Well, I love media. I'm a creator, right? At my heart, I've created, a bunch of different brands in my day. So when I was in New York in the '90s, I went to school at night at Fordham. I was going to be a cop. I grew up in Brooklyn. My dad a bartender, my mom a nurse. When I told my guidance counselor in 1987, they said, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "Well, I read this story on Brown University. You can make your own degree, and I think like computers and psychology are coming together." And my guidance counselor laughed in my face. At the last minute, I got accepted to Fordham, but my dad had his bar taken away by the feds in 1988 in the summer because he got behind on his taxes when the market crashed. Everybody didn't pay their bills. So the feds came, took his business. He said, "Take care of your mom. I'm going to jail. And there's no money for college or anything, and they're probably going to take the house." So I said, "Okay, Pop, I'll take care of Mom."
And now you've had, 2,000 episodes of This Week in Startups. You've got this hit podcast, All
She
In.
doesn't like the story of my childhood. It makes me way too, Ben, it makes me way too sympathetic.
Well, no, it's just because we're a short podcast. And we want to ask you about this because actually, in prepping for this interview, a couple of VCs said to me, "Didn't Jason get his start as a journalist?"
Yeah.
And you did start Silicon Alley Reporter in the '90s, and you founded Weblogs, which you sold to AOL. So do you consider yourself having been a journalist or more a media entrepreneur? What do you classify what you're doing now in This Week in
Sure.
Startups or All In?
So I started what's called a zine, which is before both of your times, I think. That's how I created Cyber Surfer, then Silicon Alley Reporter. But I wasn't classically trained, and I obviously wasn't elite enough to be at the New York Times or any of those fine institutions that you guys come from. But anyway, I was very enamored with accumulating power because I had none and I had watched my dad lose everything. And so I decided I would try to be powerful and rich.
It's interesting because I think most journalists. I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot of power in the business, but I am curious as you sort of look at the tensions, this sort of current, to me, like kind of, I'm sick of it, war between tech and media. Where do you see the sort of original sin of this relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the tech. I used to host a poker game at Kara Swisher's conference, and Walt Mossberg and Kara Swisher, Esther Dyson, Tim O'Reilly, they were very kind to me in the early days because I had no money, but I was starting to accumulate a little power, and they would give me a free ticket to their events. And then the gutting of the media business was the turning point. So we did blogging, and when we started Weblogs Inc. 2003 or 4 and did Engadget, all of a sudden Walt Mossberg was like, "Wait a second, I'm covering the iPhone. I'm the powerful person at the Wall Street Journal."
Basically, they start to see you as a threat in your view.
Well, when we started getting more views than they did, and when we started breaking stories before they did, those are the two pieces.
What
of
year is this,
currency.
Jason, that you're talking about?
2003, 2004.
But that's also when the Code Conference really starts. And that's when, so they're giving you free tickets to events and you think they're also really envious and
Sure.
and
Yeah.
holding you
All
back.
those things can be true. Yeah. So what happened was Craigslist, online advertising, Google gutted the revenue streams of these publications. And then blogs, podcasts later, started taking the scoops. And so that's one piece of what happened. Then you had publications like Gawker and Nick Denton, who had a very unique, and I competed with him directly and beat him on every single vector in which we competed. Engadget was bigger than Gizmodo, Autoblog bigger than his whatever it was, Jalopnik. Not that anybody was counting, but we had a friendship. Kid from Brooklyn, this weird, like subtly gay aggressive English journalist publishers. And the reason I bring that up was because he wanted to expose what he felt was hypocrisy.
Right.
And he that manifested in two things. Rich people and closeted gay people were like two of his obsessions when I would talk to him. And he went after Peter Thiel. Now, Peter at the time had investors in the Middle East region where, people forget this, but 20 years ago, Anderson Cooper, Peter Thiel, and Tim Cook were in the closet.
And in tech and in Silicon Valley, that was a real change, right? Like this was stuff that had been off limits that was suddenly on limits.
Yes, it was completely off limits. And you wouldn't call people names like Kara Swisher and Prof G do now. Like that was off limits. You didn't attack people in that very personal, vitriolic way. People adopted that because it got ratings. And then the key piece was he said to his bloggers in like a little bit of desperation because he was losing to me and other people, I will just pay you based upon views. And then they would publish sex tapes, rumors, all this stuff to get the views.
And the sex tape stuff in retrospect is so appalling.
So that was
honestly.
the turning point for journalists. And that's when journalists went from being like the quality of your work as a profession to what you could deliver in terms of impressions. And then you had BuzzFeed take Denton's playbook and run with it. So if you're asking about the history of it, that was kind of the setup.
I think there's a lot to that, but I wonder if I can just turn it back to Silicon Valley for a minute, because the people in Silicon Valley, it feels like, had considered themselves like, look, like I'm not the mayor of New York, I'm not a public person. Suddenly, I'm being covered that way, and at the same time, I think they were probably more powerful than the mayor of New York. And I'm curious, like, do you feel like there was some level of naivete in the Valley of like, hey, look, we are the richest, most powerful people in the world. There's going to be a level of scrutiny that comes with that?
I think, if you watch that progression I'm talking about from, the business being gutted, then Gawker, BuzzFeed, and doing all that like clickbait stuff. And then you look at losing the scoops to faster, more nimble news sources like Engadget.
Oh, sure. I'll grant you the sort of industrial resentments.
Yeah,
for
but the
sure.
next piece was Facebook. Zuck was largely immoral character. Like he just copied anybody's ideas, and the amount of power he accumulated and the influence it was having, that also kind of tweaked people. And so back to
Right,
power.
but forget us being tweaked. Yeah. The most powerful people in the world for the last hundreds of years have been covered very aggressively.
Wait, hold on. Is that the question, Ben? Should the powerful people be scrutinized? Sure.
But do you think that there was some naivete in Silicon Valley about, hey, look, like we are legitimate objects of coverage?
Can I jump in here?
You don't like my question, Nayeema.
I want him to answer, but I
Look at you guys getting all riled up.
no, but here's the thing. Look, Ben and I were talking about this before you showed up here, and we actually also identified Valleywag as a critical turning point. So I think we can all agree that that's a big inflection point. I think what's surprising to me, the narrative you seem to be articulating is journalism got jealous of tech because tech and new media was putting old journalism out of business. I think,
That's
the
a big
other
piece
side of that is that
You don't think that's a big piece?
well, I think I think that's relevant.
Yeah, I agree with Jason here, by the way.
But I think the other part of this is really at the same time, people in Silicon Valley were amassing power.
More power than the New York Times?
Yeah, in some ways, power and influence. They were becoming, donors to political campaigns.
At what point do you think tech had more power than the New York Times? What year would you put as a tipping point?
My time in San Francisco from 2012 to 2016, I saw that flip happen. And it's not about the relative power, right? It's about, are they becoming powerful? Is there accountability? And I don't think Nick Denton outing people is accountability journalism. I don't think that's it. But I think the sitting down for the tough interview, having your technology, your approach, your investments criticized, the hockey stick growth that's shown in every single deck that's pitched to every single VC kind of held up to scrutiny and said, hey, well, was Theranos what Theranos claimed to be? Those things were real questions that I think you, as someone who started a media organization in the 90s, don't you think there's some worth in that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm known for asking the most challenging questions, I think, on my podcast. So, I mean, did you see my interview with Trump?
Yeah, yes. But don't you think there's this second part that you're not acknowledging fully here, which is that tech was becoming more powerful in a way that it had to be covered more?
I don't know that I need to acknowledge the fact that tech is the most powerful force in the world. I mean, isn't that kind of table stakes? I mean, do you want me to say it explicitly? Tech is more powerful than the New York Times.
Then why are they so upset about it?
I think it's because it's being done in a very classless way. And when you read the stories, when you're the subject and you see the tools in which the journalists apply their trade, that they're doing it in bad faith. The reason why I think the industry thinks that the media is kind of bankrupt, it happened when Trump was elected. And when Trump was elected, if you believe Trump is an existential threat and you think he's Hitler and you think he would have taken a second term and stolen the election, which I believe he would have, and I believe he tried on January 6th. So when that happened, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Guardian, they saw Trump as an existential crisis. So you put these two stories together. Link baiting, the stories being written were being, the headlines were being written because of Ben's exceptional job at BuzzFeed at clickbaiting. Then the New York Times felt they needed to clickbait. The link baiting headlines, the use of anonymous sources, and just a general.
You grew up in New York. You read the New York Post. Like, this stuff is not. We did not invent
Yeah,
this
but we
on the
didn't
internet.
expect it from the New York Times. You hire advocacy journalists. They feel they have to stop Trump. And then all of a sudden, that's when it all broke down, I believe.
Here's a question for you, Jason. There's intensification, headlines, problematic, clickbait, et cetera. That was certainly a thing of a certain time. But how much of that, what role did tech have in all of this, particularly the kind of headlines and the snippetization? Because that was also part of the technological reality.
Yeah, seriously, can't we blame you for this?
Oh, I would say Facebook was the dance partner. They were more than happy to take your money at BuzzFeed and to bullshit you into thinking that you were their partner, and you woke up with your throat slit.
I think the question that I'm super interested in, that you're right in the middle of now, is this question of, like, is Silicon Valley building an alternative media? And do you see yourself
100%.
as building kind of an alternative right now?
Well, I mean, it's a side hustle. It's not like anybody's doing this because they want to. Going direct is a much better process for any business person. I tell all the founders who we invest in, do not talk to the press, because they will 9 times out of 10, just frame all the bad things about your business. And you've got to learn to communicate directly with your customer base. I mean, if a New York Times journalist calls a tech company, you can just assume you're going to get destroyed. And so you should not engage with them. And when the journalists call me, I say, well, ask me a question on Twitter. I'll answer it there.
All In is obviously a hit podcast. Here are 4 guys who have money, who are now elite, even if they weren't born that way, who have power and who have their own interests and their own opinions, and they're putting it out into the world, right? So you're not creating this like middle of the road, vanilla show that you're talking about. You're creating something that is of the moment. Why create that as opposed to some alternative?
You seem a little tweaked by it.
No, I'm not tweaked by it. I listen to sometimes.
Does she seem tweaked, Ben?
No, she's a fan. She's a fan.
She's a fan. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the intentionality. I don't speak for my partners on All In, nor do I speak for All In. It's just 4 individuals who get together because during COVID, we didn't get to see each other at poker. All In was started because it's fun for us to just catch up. And so there was no intentionality of creating an alternative. And it just happens to have blown all other podcasts in the space out of the world by a factor.
Do you think something is lost when the executives you invest in, see that as basically an alternative to ever being challenged, ever going to an environment where they're answering tough questions?
You don't think I've been challenging to folks? Have you heard my interviews?
I did not think the interview with Musk was really pushing him on hard questions about his business. I think it was being really sympathetic to the challenges he faces and trying to draw him out.
Yeah. So I think the question you should really be asking is, why are so many people drawn to these new properties? And why are these new properties getting many, many more listeners than your properties?
I mean, I'm glad. I mean, I think that's a super interesting question. I thought you were a little disdainful of scale and clickbait and traffic and all that stuff.
No, I mean, we don't do any
but
clickbait.
I think that's super interesting. Congratulations on your scale. But what I'm asking is something different, which is,
there's no intentionality to the scale.
Isn't there something valuable to the public in a more confrontational style of interview, in a universe in which powerful people, even if they hate it, feel like they have to go into those environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think people, if you're asking if I think Kamala Harris should do All In.
Yeah, I am asking that.
Yeah, we've asked her many times. We asked Biden. I would love to have them on. I would like to ask them challenging questions like I asked Trump.
By the same token, do you think that Donald Trump should be, giving interviews to the New York Times or people like us?
Of course. Yeah,
And
of course.
And
Yeah.
Elon
I mean,
Musk?
I think
And
people
Elon
should
Musk?
talk. Well, I mean, at a certain point, I think if you um, are so vicious to people, I wouldn't talk about Elon because I don't talk about him because we're personal friends, but just in general, if the press is so brutal to somebody, it is their right to not engage them. And, that's just the way of the world. And I think what we're seeing is a pendulum swinging back and forth where the public doesn't trust the media. And the media, we're sitting here with you guys asking me all these hard questions as if I'm the arbiter. I'm not the arbiter. The audience is the arbiter. The arbiter thinks that the mainstream media is bankrupt and liars. And if you look at the statistics of your profession, the trust in media has plummeted. Why? The conversation here should be more
Yeah.
introspective. Why does the public not trust us anymore? Why do they think that we are in the bag and we have an agenda? It's because of what happened when journalists lost their mind during Trump and
Well,
with
I think
clickbait.
also I wanna add on to that with some facts, which is that the same decline in
So as
trust
if
that you've
I didn't
seen.
say facts right now?
No, but I think that it's not just the
Oh,
media that's
spicy.
lost trust. There's been a decline in trust in institutions. Every
Sure.
Gallup or Pew study that shows this also
Okay.
shows that there's a decline in institutions, including big tech,
Yeah.
including in,
Oh,
if the audience.
people trust entrepreneurs and big tech much more than they trust media.
Name is exactly right. There's a huge decline in trust in institutions. Certain entrepreneurs are exploiting that very effectively to build, and often to build great new products. I mean, in some
Yeah.
sense, we're running a startup. We are in some sense also exploiting that.
Hmm.
But I guess I'm sort of surprised that you aren't concerned about what's being lost there. You're cheerleading the demise of trust in the media here.
No, I think the media has to look at the fact that they're not doing fact checking anymore.
Are you doing fact checking on All In?
On All In, we have a conversation, but we don't like fact check it after the fact, but the audience does like pretty routinely. Yeah.
I think when people are talking about their lack of trust in the media, they're not talking about their lack of trust in the New York Times. They're talking about their lack of trust in all this content that's out there, including the Joe Rogans, including the Tucker Carlsons, including the
Sure.
whole thing, including the
Sure.
All In guys. The idea that like anyone can be news now, anyone can be seen as the arbiter of
Is a great
truth
thing.
is a great thing.
Yeah, it's great.
Is
I
it? I
mean,
guess
why
that's
would
the
you
question.
trust but one news source that has failed you and has lied to you and does link baiting headlines?
Or that's occasionally mean to your friends.
I was just pulling up the Gallup, to your point about consulting sources, the 2023 Gallup, historically low faith in US institutions. Yeah, newspapers are low. They hover around 20%, and tech is around the 20s too. So I think there is a real, and it's a decline that's happened over time. Small businesses, mom and pop shops, unions, those are some of the few things that are retaining some level of trust, and even small businesses see their trust declining.
Small podcasts, small media startups.
We're the startup here, Jason. This week in startups, it's us. But
Great.
but I think I want to engage your
You looking
question in
for
really good
investors?
faith, because this conversation has become adversarial in a way that I actually didn't expect it to be. And maybe that's why I am like, to the extent I'm tweaked, maybe I'm tweaked by that.
You're
But like,
tweaked for sure.
no, not really. I never, I'm
I mean,
just,
I've done hundreds of interviews. I sense hostility from you.
no,
No, I think you're projecting it, Jason. I think
Am I
that like this
projecting? Ooh,
media
maybe.
tech thing has
No.
like
I think it's reaction formation on your part. I don't take this very seriously.
yes.
You know why this is so contentious? Because there's so little at stake.
You think there's so little at stake?
Yeah, I do actually.
So imagine a world without media, and Theranos had just kept going and kept going. Don't you think that the Wall Street Journal's reporting, that John Carreyrou's reporting, was helpful and instructive to
Oh, he's
society
great.
in that
Should have been a
moment?
Pulitzer. Yeah, he should have won. He should have won an award for that.
Yeah. So where
Yeah.
is that work going to be done in a world where,
Yeah, I mean, I am concerned about investigative journalism. I think funding that is super important. But this is a business, so if you look at media, this is not some like virtuous, like vocation. This is a business. You're in a business. The New York Times is in a business.
you're saying we're not it's not virtuous and they don't make any money? That's tough.
But I think it's interesting that you think that Carreyrou should have won a Pulitzer for that. So you are concerned about the death of investigative
I
journalism?
mean, I think people who short stocks, those people who are advocacy,
Yeah, like as short sellers,
placing,
hedge funders
yeah,
that
and
do the
so like
research.
that, if you look at what they're doing, that serves a purpose in a free society.
Yeah, but not everything is public in the public market. So like we can't expect short sellers to be who certainly are in a business, by the way.
The second half of the sentence is
Mhm.
that I think investigative journalists play a similar role.
Yeah, the last question I'd ask you, Jason, is because like this has been interesting to see. Do you think that there's some mutual beneficiality of the tension between tech and media? Like even this conversation, like the
Yeah,
way that people have to interplay with one another or attack one
yeah.
another.
You should. I'll refer to Bob Dylan. Trust yourself. So don't trust me. Don't trust you. Trust yourself. That's what you need to do in this new media landscape. Trust no one, to quote the X Files. So you need to, as an individual, find your own truth. And you were probably living in, and all of us were living in this delusion that you could trust politicians, scientists, or journalists, or CEOs. I would trust no one. I would trust yourself to go find your own answers.
Spoken like a true populist. Um,
Am I a
and
populist? Oh,
though that was a populist credo. Thanks for coming into what I think you saw as the lion's den, but we were honestly pretty interested to explore your thoughts.
Thank you, Jason.
I do enjoy your podcast. Good start.
He thought we were tweaked, and we were kind of we were jumping in over each other in that interview.
Yeah, he came in with I mean, it was so classic. People have these fixed ideas in Silicon Valley of what the media is and where we were coming from. And I think we were like actually much more kind of interested in trying to understand how he thought, and he was coming sort of to fight.
But in what I thought was fascinating was when we had this conversation at the top about what is really the dividing moment between tech and media. We identified Wag, which is a big part of it and was part of his answer. But his answer, I mean, this is a funny thing about Jason. It's like it all comes down to him and how successful he was that like irked the tech reporters of the time or what it
Yeah.
was. But I think that there is a business side to this story.
It's true. The media is mad at technology and is trying to screw it. Rupert Murdoch does this most openly, where he'll go
Yeah.
after YouTube in the pages of the Times of London or something. But
Yeah.
but it's part of the fabric. But although it's also sort of a conspiracy theory and doesn't really speak to what motivates journalists waking up in the morning and doing their jobs.
And the other thing is that the incentives were aligned for a moment in time where you were running BuzzFeed and Facebook was there. And there was this camaraderie in the business story that completely forked.
I mean, to me, honestly, the most depressing thing about it is this the kind of trust no one stuff. I do think that like there's this real embrace of just this absolute populism because if you're doing a tech startup, it allows you to operate without any kind of scrutiny, without any regulation. The weaker the government, the weaker the watchdogs are, the better off you are, like as an investor, basically. But I think it's such a short-sighted approach to the world just to cheerlead that kind of collapse of trust.
But also, so can be the trust only me model, right? There's something in between the trust no one and trust me and me alone, both of which I think are kind of dangerous
Yeah.
perspectives.
Yeah, it's a fun because he's actually basically, as he says, a quite moderate guy politically
Yeah.
and has worked on both sides, but that's actually a very, very radical view.
I think he was playing a part, though. I think he was playing a part for us
Yeah.
a little bit, don't you think?
Yeah. Oh, for sure, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, it is funny. He's been sort of a punching bag for the media for so long that he just sort of slips into that role. There's a level of like ritual to these fights that I'm honestly a little sick of.
Part of the fight is real. There's a sense of disintermediation that feels like fair game, fair play, but there's also some pettiness to all this, right? Like,
Of
and
course, it's personal.
it's
Yes.
personal. These are big boys with bigger egos and thinner skin.
And honestly, like I do think they are really don't understand the notion that that this wasn't that the invention of aggressive and sometimes really unpleasant journalism about powerful people like didn't start in 2007 and with them.
Yes, exactly. And also that they are no longer the people they were in 1967 or 1977 or whenever. Just this obsession with elitism and elite institutions, the kind of free speech argument from people who are extremely rich, extremely powerful, and have huge megaphones now.
Yeah, it's amazing how much resentment and deep resentment there is from people who you would think shouldn't have time to be resentful, like have really been incredibly successul and have great
Yeah.
lives, but spend a lot of time resenting journalists who they also say they don't care about and are irrelevant.
It's a big potential advertisement for, like, inner child therapy from, like, Better Health or some other tech giant, you know?
Oh, wow, we
Like,
should call them up. That'd be a
we
great
should
sponsor.
call them
We,
and
you
say
know, I loved, as you know, direct response advertising, so we should see if we can get into that business.
I
All
do.
right.
All right. Well, that was quite a doozy of a conversation. Let's take a quick break, and when we're back, we're gonna have Max Tani here to cleanse our palates with some blind spot. Hi, Max. Welcome. What a breath of fresh air you will be with this blind spot, I think.
I'm happy to be here. How'd the conversation go? Was it as good as an episode of the All In podcast?
I'm not sure Jason and Naeema left as besties, I
I
would
don't know.
say.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. It was my aspiration to become the fifth bestie. What's the blind spot, Max? What are we missing this week?
Well, the blind spot this week is a big story in media, in a certain corner of media that's dominating that corner, but most people will never hear about and will not register to them at all, which is that the biggest reporter in basketball, Adrian Wojnarowski, who is better known as Woj.
Yeah, no one has ever said his whole name before.
Yeah,
Woj.
I've said his handle many times, but I've never said his full name. But he's better known as Woj. Announced abruptly that he was retiring from his job at ESPN and was going instead to become the GM of the men's basketball program at St. Bonaventure, which is a really, really big deal in basketball reporting. Woj basically has a monopoly. Lena Khan should have been investigating him years ago. He has a monopoly on NBA scoops. He gets all of the big ones basically for the last 10 years. Plus, he's been completely dominating the beat and breaking every single major story. And so it sent a bunch of shockwaves through the NBA, not the least because he was actually only halfway through a $35 million contract with
Oof.
ESPN. And that was one of the reasons why I was interested in this story was because, at a time when there's so much diminishment in media and people think that it's, dying and it's shriveling up. I think Woj was actually an example of the type of place where it's still thriving. I actually think that he's leaving at the exact wrong time because as you guys have talked about, if we talked about on the podcast before, there's never been a better time to cover the business of sports, to cover the transactions and kind of everything that's going on. I think clearly this was just like an opportunity that he had and he wanted to kind of step away from staying up till the middle of the night to tweet like the most boring transaction possible. But there's actually never been more eyeballs on those types of stories, which is like a kind of a strange irony. And it actually presents a lot of opportunities for many reporters who want to take his place.
Do I sense some ambition there, Max?
I am apparently interviewing Joel Embiid next week, so we'll see if that can launch my my sports career.
Oh, good. I love this. That's it for us for this week. Thanks for tuning in to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. Our show is produced by Max Tani, Allison Rogers, Gina Ozaki, Max Toomey, Noah Friedman, and Andrea Lopez Cruzado. With special thanks to Britta Galanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, and Jules Zern. Our engineer is Rick Kwan. Our theme music is by Billy Libby, and our public editor is Mark Andreessen. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for listening.
He's definitely reading Semaphore.
He's definitely tweeting Semaphore.
This is why we chose the color yellow, because he tweeted the screenshot with no link, and so that's,
Yes. And speaking of that, we wanted to give a special thanks to Riverside, didn't you, Ben?
Yeah, special thanks to Riverside, the really technically excellent platform on which we produce this, whose CEO I absolutely bombarded in the middle of the night the other day because we had some exclusive interviews with alleged would-be Donald Trump assassin, and a very sensitive, interesting interview with him that was buried in their system from a year ago. And I called, emailed, LinkedIn messaged the CEO, Nadav Kaysan, and his brother in the middle of the night until I got a hold of one of them, and they incredibly graciously dug it out for us and helped us break some news. So thank you, Riverside.
I would make a booty call joke here, but I won't.
Thank you. And then thank you, Nayeema.
You're welcome. If you like Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like us, give us a review.
If you're watching on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe to Semaphore's channel.
And I can't even believe I still have to say this, but if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe to Semaphore's media newsletter, which publishes every Sunday night.
Before you leave us to become Woj.
Someone now listening, it will be Woj.